without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Philip Rad.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And so thank you to everyone who also made this possible. Thank you to Lee. Thank you to Ms. Moyen. So when Dr. Williams asked me to speak today on International Peace Day, I looked a bit into what Peace Day is, and I thought a bit about why it is that I might have anything to say on International Peace Day. What I came up with is something of a suggestion, and it's a suggestion that will allow me to speak about the current time, the time that we live in, and share with you a bit about my experience and about Lebanon. So so I've been living in Lebanon for about 3 years. So the suggestion is that in order to kind of take a first step towards peace beginning today, we should, in the current moment, grapple with the concept of crisis. Why is that? Well, here in the United States, perhaps more than any time in recent decades, we have found ourselves in the midst of crisis. Of course, I'm referring to the public health crisis that has accompanied the spread of COVID-19. Let me first also share my screen. That would be a good thing to do. Okay. So the suggestion that I came up with today on International Peace Day is that in order to kind of work towards peace in the current moment, we need to really be able to grapple with the concept of crisis. The reason for that is that here in the United States, perhaps kind of more than any other time in recent years, we have found ourselves in the midst of crises like the public health crisis associated with COVID-19, the memory of the financial crisis in 2008, the climate crisis, of course, which is ongoing and becoming worse at an alarming rate, the current unemployment and housing crises in the United States, and the crisis on the level of race relations. And those are just some of many crises. Those are probably the biggest ones. These crises, of course, overlap and feed off of one another. The particular anxiety that comes with these crises is more familiar to certain sectors of U.S. society than others, but it is nonetheless an anxiety that registers in questions that we are all asking. So that's kind of like the first theme, which is we increasingly live in a time of crisis. In this time of crisis, it's hard to see the possibility for a just, sustainable, equitable peace in the Middle East and in the world. And so we're asking these questions, which are kind of, how did we get here? What is going to happen? Why do things feel out of control? How can I protect myself and those closest to me? And kind of, among other questions. And I think, okay. So for a lot of people, there is a quick solution to crisis. One of those solutions is that we need a strong leader. We need someone to guide us through. Leaders give us a feeling of comfort. They make us feel as though someone knows something that we don't know and exercises a power that we don't have on our behalf. While good leadership actually is something that mitigates the more unpleasant side of crisis, ultimately I think crisis has become so pervasive in contemporary society, whether we like it or not, that it will take more than a strong leader to part the waters. That is, to pull us through this time of crisis and into a time which feels relatively more peaceful, more stable, if that is going to be possible at all. So one of the things that I think we need, and here I'm kind of discussing a concept that I am interested in my work as kind of someone who's interested in cultural studies and in social theory. So I'm kind of borrowing this concept from social theory for the purpose of this talk. And that concept is cognitive mapping. So cognitive mapping is a concept, it's a bit abstract, but I think it's relevant and can help us today. So cognitive mapping may even actually be an antidote to the environment of customized news, which has developed over the past decade on social media and cable TV, in which we are fed the type of information that keeps us coming back to the platforms and the same news sites over and over. The idea of cognitive mapping that I want to talk about is analogous to what a taxi driver does as they drive around town. Taxi drivers know their city like the back of their hand, but they rely on a particular type of knowledge. At any given moment, good taxi drivers know more or less what is going on in the city, where there's traffic, where there's a shortcut, and who you might see walking down the road. Taxi drivers constantly balance, on the one hand, the information available to them in their immediate environment and what is really a mental picture of the city. For the majority of us living here in the United States, a big country, our experience of daily life is defined by a gap between our immediate private perspective and the absent, highly complex world in which we live. At any given time of day, we don't feel the need to think about the way society works around the world. We make decisions based solely on the information available to us in the here and now. In keeping with the analogy, unlike the taxi driver, we drive through life without a cognitive map, without thinking about how our lives fit into the context of the movement of the entire city. To make matters worse, many of us have become so comfortable in our reliance upon our technological devices to tell us where to go that we could not even find our way without them. Another suggestion that kind of comes with cognitive mapping is that when society functions normally here in the United States, it is very difficult, if possible, to feel that one is connected to a larger social order, not to mention come up with some mental image of it. During times of crisis, however, we are confronted with the reality that we are all connected, that we are all living in the same society, and that the movement of that society always already involves us in one way or another. So COVID-19 has brought this clearly into view. It has shown us that our behavior has direct consequences on the lives of other people, and the opposite is true as well, that other people's lives also impact us. During a crisis, we feel the world come crashing into our private space. When we, for example, have to wear a mask, or we must socially distance, or even quarantine and stay inside to stay safe. So kind of, here's the idea. So what we ought to strive for during this time, and this is by no means easy, is to balance our own individual perspectives on the one hand, and an imaginative picture of the world we inhabit on the other. This is very difficult, of course, since the world we inhabit is so big and so complex that it cannot be fully understood in a single picture without some kind of serious imagination. On top of that, it's a world that's always changing. That said, we know that there are some basic laws governing modern society. What cognitive mapping allows us to see is that any situation of crisis, put simply, is always symptomatic of the way in which society as a whole functions today. So yeah, so I'm kind of drawing on this concept from social theory to basically say that crisis is always going to be a symptom of the functioning of society as a whole. And I think that's really an important idea to keep in mind when we talk about Lebanon. And then, of course, also this is important, which is that what this also implies is that we ought to first realize that even the way in which we experience the world is contingent upon our specific place in it. Modern society is highly complex, and yet we must come to terms with the fact that now, more than ever, everything is related, that even our experience is specific to a certain position in society and history. Even the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we understand our world is contingent upon our place in that, in modern society. So it is for this reason that we may say that the average resident of a smaller country like Lebanon, where I have lived over the past 3 years, experiences contemporary society differently than we do here in the United States. And of course, I don't consider myself, I'm still putting myself in the kind of category of a resident of a larger country. So people who live in Lebanon know that the nature of lived experience in the contemporary world largely depends on one's position in it. Residents of smaller countries feel the gravitational pull of developments in larger countries. In the same way, they know that what goes on in larger countries, how Europe, North America, and Asia choose to commit capital to crises like climate change, economic volatility, political turmoil, and public health directly impacts their lives as well. I'm drawing on these ideas to kind of contextualize my discussion of Lebanon. So I'm going to kind of really try to focus on how the crisis situation in Lebanon is instructive of the need to balance the immediate here and now with a kind of mental picture of modern society as a whole. So Lebanon is found in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its neighbors are Syria to the east and north, and Israel-Palestine to the south. It's a small country of about 6 million people. A significant percentage of the people who live in Lebanon are not, in fact, Lebanese citizens. The United Nations has about 480,000 Palestinian refugees registered in Lebanon, living in refugee camps for decades now. Many of them have lived in Lebanon for over 70 years, unable to return to formerly Palestinian lands occupied by Israel since the mid-20th century. The United Nations has also provided yearly aid to hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in Lebanon over the course of the past 9 years. So I did not include an estimate of the number of Syrian refugees who are currently in Lebanon, but in the past I've seen upwards of 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, even up to 2 million, and I think that numbers kind of changed over the past few years as people come back and forth. But that's pretty remarkable to consider the possibility that you have almost 500,000 Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon and almost 1.5 to 2 million Syrian refugees living in a country of about 4 or 5 million people. So I've also included here a quick comparison between Lebanon and South Carolina. which shows that while Lebanon and South Carolina are similar in terms of population, in terms of the size of their population, the GDP, the gross domestic product of Lebanon, is much smaller than that of South Carolina. And you can also see evidence of Lebanon's extraordinarily high dependence on the international finance and aid market in the form of debt. So yeah, although the debt crisis is actually a pressing matter, I will move on now to talk about the situation in the country as it stands today. Okay, so yeah, as I'm sure many of you are aware, on August 4th, 2020, Beirut, Lebanon witnessed one of the largest and most devastating explosions in modern history, an explosion which severely impacted much of the city. My own former apartment was within the damaged area, as was my route for daily exercise. Of course, that's not saying much because it took out a lot of the city, but it is kind of scary and maddening to think that that I could have been walking by there, you know, while this happened. So I'm going to show this short video to have this image in mind of the explosion that took place about 6 weeks ago in Beirut.
لوزك عم يطلع انفجارات على البور. يلا باي. يا ويلاه. Oh my god. الله عمل ذرة يعني. يا صورت دخيل ربك شفت روح بدق رميشها ده في راس خليني دق لمرة متأكد ده في راس خليني دق لمرة هي مرة الله بيبي وينك طلع انفجار بالبور هي انا عم صور وما بعرف اذا مبين عندي.
Over 200 people died as a result of the explosion. Thousands were injured, including over 1,000 children. At one point, it was estimated that 300,000 residents of the city were displaced due to damage in their homes. About 6 weeks later, today, Lebanon is still reeling from the blast, still attempting, as the common saying goes, to stand up on its own 2 feet. Tragically, several people who went missing were never found. Many are still recovering from traumatic injuries, and some will never recover. The blast, which was by all accounts only the most dramatic consequence of decades of mismanagement, of political crisis, was not the only major blow that the Lebanese people have sustained in recent years. Indeed, the Lebanese are no strangers to collateral damage. In a sense, as the country with the highest per capita number of refugees in the world, Lebanon is the epitome of a nation for whom a liberal centralized government, coupled with internal social dynamics, has done little to keep the outside world at bay, as it were. So to elaborate on this further, on this idea of Lebanon as kind of the epitome of a nation for whom kind of like national borders has really not done a lot to keep the outside world outside, I will talk first a bit about the Lebanese system of governance and the multiple crises that have faced the country in recent years. One of the major internal reasons for the inability of the Lebanese state to prevent drastic crisis in the country is the issue of how it is structured. Lebanon functions on a political sectarian model of governance. that is, a style of power distribution based on religious and ethnic identity. Lebanese citizens belong to a variety of religious and ethnic groups called tawa'if, the singular being ta'ifa. Before the founding of the Lebanese state and into the contemporary period, so the Lebanese state was founded in the middle of the 20th century. These tawa'if have lived in relative isolation. While many Lebanese do in fact inhabit areas and neighborhoods that contain families of different sects, it is also the case that one finds in Lebanon entire neighborhoods and towns that are inhabited exclusively by the adherents of a particular religious sect. So there's a revealing anecdote I often tell from the time that I was working, from the time when I was working at a high school in the mountains of Lebanon. During that time, I accompanied students to the Model UN conference in the capital city, in Beirut. After the conference, the students would express to me how great it was to meet people from different cultures. This despite the fact that all of the students at the conference were Lebanese. So within the Lebanese sectarian system of government, each ta'ifa or sect is allocated a certain number of seats in parliament. The parliament is elected by the people. However, the members of each ta'ifa, for the most part, only elect representatives of their own sect. The parliament in turn elects the president of the republic. Okay, so yeah, the parliament elects the president of the republic, the speaker of the house, and the prime minister. Each of these three positions must also be occupied by a member of a certain religious group. In this case, the three largest groups. Thus, the president of the republic must be a Maronite Catholic, the speaker of the parliament must be a Shiite Muslim, and the prime minister must be a Sunni Muslim. The prime minister, in agreement with the parliament and the president, creates a cabinet, which then effectively performs the day-to-day operations of the Senate. Of the state. So the president agrees with the prime minister and the parliament to form a government. Over the past year, 2 different governments have actually resigned, and a third is being created as we speak. So why have these 2 governments resigned in the last 12 months? Well, what I've done next is put together something of an overview or a timeline of the major events in Lebanon's recent history, to kind of explain why these 2 governments have not been able to kind of stand the test of time. So let's begin with the Ta'if Accord, which was signed in the city of Ta'if in Saudi Arabia in 1989. The goal of the Ta'if Accord was to put to an end the 15-year-long civil war that saw sectarian strife end in the deaths of over 120,000 people. By that time, Syria had invaded Lebanon in 1976, and Israel had invaded southern Lebanon in 1982. While the warring factions largely disbanded, and the number of Muslims in parliament was raised to 50%, to equal the 50% of Christians in the parliament, many of the former leaders of these factions found places in the new government. An important thing to note here is that during this time, the invasion of southern Lebanon by Israel was responded to by a new resistance movement of mostly poor Shiites living in southern Lebanon. This movement came to be known today as the largest, most powerful political party in the country and de facto government in the south and in the west, Hezbollah. Of course, Hezbollah is, while it's considered a legitimate political party by most in Lebanon, it is considered to be a terrorist organization by the United States. Since the time of the Ta'if Agreement, much of the sectarian conflict that took place during the Civil War has continued by other means. The leaders of the three large groups in the government have turned things like garbage collection, electricity, and water into pieces of the pie over which they have the right to control and exploit for personal gain as they wish. A political culture, of cult of personality style support for sectarian leaders fuels this and allows it to continue. Leaders like the President Michel Aoun, who's something of a right-wing Catholic leader, Saad al-Hariri, who was the Sunni prime minister for a long time, and Hassan Nasrallah, here he's the kind of ideological and political leader of Hezbollah, although he doesn't occupy a place in the official government. They had received for years widespread support among the supporters of their respective, the members of their respective sects, and with very little accountability from the people they represent regarding their words or their actions. For all three of these major figures, and others also, and perhaps most importantly for Hassan Nasrallah, political life in the country had been much more about maintaining a certain image as a populist, fearless leader and well-connected patron than any type of real political platform. This began to really change with the rise in unemployment and poverty that has been exacerbated by the debt crisis and the crisis related to the currency, which began last year. And I'll talk about that now. So until the third quarter of last year, the Lebanese economy benefited from the artificial pegging of the Lebanese currency to the US dollar. This meant that I, for example, would receive my graduate school stipend in Lebanese lira, but I wouldn't have to buy American dollars if I wanted them. I would just ask my bank to give me the money in dollars. So one indicator of the positive impact that this had on the Lebanese economy was the widespread presence of domestic workers in middle-income Lebanese households who came to the country from Sri Lanka and Ethiopia and other countries for very low pay. But since the currency was pegged to the dollar, these domestic workers could send the money back in dollars to their home countries and benefit from local exchange rates. The Lebanese government and private banks maintain this situation, this fixed exchange rate, by offering high interest rates and attracting dollars from outside the country. The other side of this was that it was accumulating more and more debt that it would not pay back, it would not be able to pay back should investors lose faith in the Lebanese banking system. This of course exacerbated the debt crisis. The debt the ratio of debt to GDP was already quite high, but it also kind of more importantly bankrupted the government. In any case, to be sure, this situation really began to unravel about 3 years ago, during the time between the beginning of war in Syria in 2011 and the time the Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri was allegedly arrested and forced to resign remotely in Saudi Arabia in 2017. That is, of course, until the French President Emmanuel Macron intervened and secured Hariri's release. During this time, fewer and fewer individuals from the international community continued to feel confident about putting their money in Lebanese banks, and many began actually to withdraw their money. With the arrest of Hariri, with the arrest of the Prime Minister, things took an abrupt turn for the worse, and soon the high-risk game of collusion between the government and the private banks was over. So now it's basically over. And I borrowed this graph on the right from Vox. So finally, in 2019, so many investors pulled their money out of Lebanon that there were no more dollars in the market. I remember one day in October of last year, I was going to a graduate student conference in Italy, and I wanted to take out some dollars from the ATM. So I went to the ATM, and of course it didn't work. It didn't give me any dollars. This led to a rush on the banks, everyone taking out their money as soon as they could. Since late last year, the price of the dollar on the currency exchange market in Lebanon has drastically increased, and the Lebanese lira has lost more and more of its value. So whereas a year ago it was pegged to the dollar and the exchange rate was 1,500, so kind of 1,500 lira would equal $1. Now it's 7,000 lira equals $1. So this means that, for example, if you had 20,000, the equivalent of $20,000 in Lebanese lira cash in your, under your pillow, now it's worth $5,000. So this brings me to the October Revolution, which was a big deal. So as things really began to unravel last year in 2019, the Lebanese people took to the streets. So between the time that I went to Italy for that graduate student conference, 2 weeks later, when I came back, there had been a mass uprising of millions of Lebanese people who kind of demanded for a complete overhaul of the sectarian political system. They, for the first time, came out in such huge numbers to denounce the entire class of sectarian leaders. And this was kind of the first time that you would see, young Shiites really going up and saying to journalists that they want to oust their own sect's leaders. Or, the same for Catholics, the same for Sunni Muslims and Druze even. So the protests became somewhat violent, of course, after a while. I remember watching from my room on live stream the clashes that were going on in the streets about a mile away. Right. So I'm going to show this. I'm going to show this video, which kind of gives you an idea of the kind of the feeling, this kind of release, this happiness that came with the October Revolution 2019. Now, of course, it seems quite distant in the past, but I'll at least give you an idea of what it was like.
Streets in all of their cities across the country, conservative, liberal, young, old, everyone's here and they're all chanting in unison against their leaders, and they're enjoying it. I've been walking down the street from the BBC office, past the main church, down to Martyrs Square, where there's the Blue Mosque, and talking to everyone about this unison and how it feels for them.
For the first time in years, I feel proud to be Lebanese, seeing all of these people out here. I've never felt such unity. there are some people who don't want these protests to happen, but we're just going to stay out here for as long as we can.
I think the people of Lebanon are fed up from all the politicians and all the lying and all the stealing and everything. So I think that's what makes us united today. And I hope that it's gonna last.
ما بتفرق بين شيعي وسني ومسيحي ودرزي، كلنا هون شعب لبناني، وهيدا الشيء اللي مقوينا بهيدي الثورة. يعني لو ما هيك نحن بنفرض، بس لأنه نحن مطالبنا وحدة ونحن كلنا جوعانين وبدنا حقوقنا، فهيدا الشيء موحدنا.
أكلنا حقوقنا إنه الثقافة، التعليم، يسمعونا، حقوقنا مش مسموعة. إذا كنا بهالإيد الوحدة وكلنا ضلينا عم ننزل على الشارع نعتصم ونطالب بحقوقنا، أكيد ساعتها حنكون مجتمع واحد وحيضل المجتمع ناجح.
Whatever the outcome is, whatever happens tonight and in the next few days, this is always going to be remembered. The chants that people are saying, people are going to remember them.
So yeah, I remember, for example, that it was really a great kind of time. School was closed, the university was closed. Nobody was going to school. Even some of the students were blocking the road so that no one could go to school and that everyone would participate in the revolution. On the ground for about a month, the revolution looked kind of like, people kind of occupying the street. There were even like kind of street food vendors that kind of popped up and would service these areas that had become completely occupied by protesters. And then of course at night there would be a lot of music, and then at times it would turn into like a clash between protesters and riot police. And it went on for quite a while, and then finally it was in what was at the time a big victory. The Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, the same one who had been arrested in Saudi Arabia in 2017, or allegedly so, stepped down again. So that's this picture here when he stepped down. Oh no. Here, yeah. A new government was formed under the direction of a former professor from the American University of Beirut named Hassan Diab. And that's him there on the right. The new government of Hassan Diab did not satisfy most of the protesters, as they saw in it merely a puppet government. That is, a government which was new on the surface, but really controlled from off stage by the same old sectarian leaders. Nevertheless, the protests did die down after a while, and of course COVID helped. Kind of the scare of COVID helped. And in fact, the new government did actually deal well with the public health crisis, with the public health crisis associated with COVID-19. And it's only recently that we have seen an increase in the number of cases, which I have here. If I can, okay. Right. So yeah, so you can see, for example, that the new cases today in the entire country are reportedly about 1,000, and the total number is 29,000. And so a lot of those have really come in the wake of the blast, which was on August 4th, in the last month, or month and a half. So nevertheless, many of the sectarian leaders have seen their power in the country wane as the economy has tanked and the people call for them to be anywhere from ousted or hanged. That particular kind of this kind of outcry against the sectarian leaders, to the point of saying that, let's kill them, that has come particularly in the wake of the explosion on August 4th. the government of Hassan Diab, of course, in the wake of the explosion, also resigned, and a new government is currently being formed at the direction of Mustafa Adib, who was the Lebanese ambassador to Germany. But it seems like he may not be able to actually do that. The French President Emmanuel Macron has actually given a 15-day window for him to form a government, but it doesn't seem like he's going to be able to do that because one of the conditions that the French president placed on the Lebanese government was that they actually share at the different sects actually share power in the government, kind of these different ministries of water, electricity, etc. And it doesn't seem like they really want to agree to do that. So to conclude this part about Lebanon and really to work towards a final conclusion, the situation in Lebanon is not sustainable the way that it is now. And a just, sustainable, equitable peace has never really been achieved since the end of the Civil War, and it probably won't be achieved in the near future. Thus, we might say, kind of in conclusion, that the cost of peace, that cost of the Ta'if agreement, has been very high for the country, and is becoming too expensive. So that said, while a lot of the discussion around who is responsible for crisis in Lebanon has been focused on the government, as is the case in the United States, no matter how terrible the Lebanese government is, I would claim that any attempt to place blame entirely on the corrupt Lebanese class of politicians, corrupt as they may be, must contend with the counterclaim that the reality, the political reality, the social reality, the economic reality in Lebanon is always already transnational. It's always already even kind of specific to a particular position in the global context, in the global society. American, French, Iranian, Israeli, Saudi foreign policy in the region have had about as much to do with Lebanon's current state as do the members of Parliament. And really, to begin towards a final conclusion, if the dire situation in Lebanon teaches us here in the US anything, I would say that it is the necessity of a certain imaginative type of knowledge that is not currently on offer in Lebanon. And that is, I think, a certain type of knowledge that comes with this idea, this kind of concept that I'm borrowing for theory, which is cognitive mapping. We here in the United States should use this period of crisis as an opportunity to think in a nuanced way about how our thoughts and feelings and experiences are specific to the material, objective conditions of life here in the United States. It is only by doing so, by working towards this kind of almost impossible idea of like a picture of society, or at least maintaining a certain respect for our inability to do so, to kind of come up with this picture of what is the kind of what would society actually look like if we could imagine it. It's only by doing so that I think we'll be able to move beyond the restricted perspective of our class and national positions. Once we do so, we will be able to overcome particularly the feeling that we are all individuals locked into a system that creates crisis necessarily. Instead, we might even collectively engage in crisis and move towards a sustainable, just, equitable peace for Lebanese people, for Palestinians, for Yemenis, for Syrians, and for all the citizens in the Middle East and the United States and the world. Thank you. That's all I have. how do I get out of this?
Thank you very much, Philip. That was
Mhm.
so enlightening. We've had several questions come in, and so I'd like to start with them. The first question came from Darren Blakey, and he asked, did they catch those who were responsible for the explosions about 6 weeks ago?
I did see something about how the people who work at the port were kind of interrogated, and some of them were arrested. But I would also say that the kind of general consensus among people that I know is that the responsibility for what happened at the port kind of goes all the way up to the top. I mean, it seems that the president was made aware of the presence of the materials at the port, as was the prime minister, the former prime minister who resigned in the wake of the explosion. And I think when they went to go ask the kind of course, and Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, denied any involvement in the port, which is of course kind of common knowledge that Hezbollah more or less runs a lot of the port, de facto kind of runs it. So yeah, so it seems like kind of there's this denial from the people at the top of any responsibility, but there has been this process of kind of placing blame on lower government officials and people who work in the port. But I don't think anyone in the country that I know of at least will be satisfied until someone at the top takes responsibility.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions, one from Dr. Bollinger and one from Mr. Curry about the role of France in Lebanon. So could you just briefly explain the role of France in Lebanon?
I think it might be quickly summarized by the kind of nickname that people have for Lebanon, which is kind of our compassionate mother. So I think at some point, Lebanon and France had this kind of almost like romantic relationship before independence, whereby, and particularly Christians, not so much other sects, but there was kind of this like kind of privileged relationship on an economic level between particularly Maronite Catholics who were living in Lebanon during the time, kind of the last stages of the Ottoman Empire, and France. So they kind of had this kind of like one-way street between France and the rest of the Ottoman Empire for imports and exports and that kind of thing. And then that translated into the French Mandate of Lebanon in the beginning of the 20th century. And then you might say that France kind of facilitated the independence of Lebanon in some way, if it was also the country that had not allowed it to be independent. So the relationship goes back pretty far. Today, I would say that there's probably a clear division between a pro-West kind of line of thinking and a pro-Iran line of thinking, and that is a real source of division in the country. The pro-West line of thinking, of course, includes France and the United States. Yeah. I think that's all I can really say about that. Yeah.
Thank you for that brief explanation. Holly Davey wanted to know quickly when the currency crisis started.
The first real kind of tangible kind of appearance of the currency crisis was in kind of September, October of last year, of 2019. And at that point, we were only really dealing with an issue of like, it was 2,000 lira to $1, which is, not such a big deal. It's pretty bad, but it's not so bad. But now it's really bad. I mean, yeah.
Thank you for that. And Katarina Moyan and I both have similar questions about what you see as the way forward for Lebanon.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that was a little bit, that's also kind of why I indulged in this kind of exercise of thinking about kind kind of almost how to think about the crisis in Lebanon. And that's because I don't know if anyone has a clear plan. I don't think anyone has a clear plan. None of the parties have come up with an economic plan to bring the country out of crisis. It does seem like the president of France will have a significant role to play in the formation of the new government, and he has promised that there would be a new political pact for Lebanon, that he would somehow kind of facilitate a move towards a more secular kind of structure in the government. But it doesn't seem like the people who are in power now are going anywhere soon, and I think if they don't move, if they don't kind of give up their seats, then nothing will change. Yeah. So yeah, it's really a dire situation. It's there's no kind of no way out from what I can see, other than really starting to think about kind of beginning from zero, kind of reconceptualizing what is going, like kind of what is the relationship between people and the government in Lebanon, how Lebanon is going to kind of place itself in the global kind of market.
Thank you.
Because tourism and banking are both kind of out right now.
Right.
Can't really. Mm.
Great. Is there any way that you think the West can help in this crisis with Lebanon?
Yeah. So again, yeah, that's a great question. So that's another I think reason why I indulged in this theoretical question. So the United States, of course, won't really be enthusiastic about any government that includes Hezbollah. So I don't think you can expect much from the United States except for money straight to the UN. So the money from the United States will go to the UN. It won't go to the government, as long as Hezbollah is in the government. Yeah. So that's how kind of I think you kind of almost are forced to think about Lebanon as only one cog in a much larger picture. Yeah.
Great. And Philip, because you are a local person who's getting your PhD in Lebanon, could you say a little bit about how this is affecting you personally, this crisis?
I think it's really shined a light on the degree to which having grown up in Rock Hill and having the privilege of living in Rock Hill, should I so desire, changes my experience in the world, and kind of changes the way that I am able to deal with crisis in that sense, kind of in the sense that it kind of is relevant today in Lebanon. I mean, I cannot imagine being who I am and having the same interests that I have and living in Lebanon and trying to survive. I don't think it would be a good situation. But merely because I have the opportunity to come back to the United States, where I do have certain material kind of opportunities, I see that difference between my friends in Lebanon who are very smart and very well educated, but they simply don't have, you know, a network in the United States, a passport. So yeah, so maybe that's that's the only real sense that I could say that it's impacted me. I mean, it destroyed my apartment. It made all my friends depressed, but all of that just really showed how privileged I am, kind of to be able to come back. Yeah.
Well, to follow up with that, are your peers, who are in your PhD program at the University of, are they able to continue their studies, or are many of them stymied right now because they're not able to continue their studies? How is that going for a lot of your friends?
Well, they are continuing their studies, but they have been doing this for their entire lives. They have been living with this. They've been living with crisis their entire lives. They've always kind of, you know, been reacclimating to the situation. Yeah, and I don't know how I would do that. I don't have that. I don't have that kind of tool set. Yeah.
And what advice do you have for Winthrop University students who are interested in international experiences or getting a PhD abroad, anything like that? What type of advice do you have to share with them?
I don't think you should listen to your parents who say that it costs a lot of money, it's not worth it. I think it's worth it. And I think you'll regret it when you don't do it. So yeah, so go ahead and do it. But at the same time, and I've told other people this too, if you could, do some traveling and really see if you want to live abroad for a while. But then the opportunity to study in the United States, I think, is wonderful. I mean, it's also something you should not, kind of, you should also kind of be aware of the value of that too.
Right. And you did go to Lebanon for a study abroad experience as an undergraduate. Is that correct?
I did, yeah. While I was at USC in Columbia, I did a 1 semester study abroad, and I think it was awesome. Yeah, if I hadn't done it, I don't think I would have continued to kind of pursue this path. Yeah, I might be doing something much more boring.
Thank you. We're glad that you're doing what you're doing because you've been a very enlightening speaker tonight. Ali Davy asked, what is school like money-wise in Lebanon, and did it change after 2019? So I'm not sure if she means like how much does it cost to go to school in Lebanon, perhaps. Question, right. And what happened after 2019 after the monetary crisis?
Right. So it didn't change so much for me, except for the fact that my stipend lost most of its value. I work as a graduate student, and I don't have to pay tuition, but people who do have to pay tuition, I know it's become much more difficult for them to do so. And I know that my university, the American University of Beirut, which puts its it prices its courses, its offerings in dollars, and I don't think it changed the prices very much. I think what you have is a situation where, and I've heard this described to me before, you now have two kind of a clear differentiation between a class of people who have dollars and a class of people who don't have dollars. Whereas you might have been a middle income family, your parents work all the time, work a lot. They work in Lebanon, they receive their pay in Lebanese lira. They can pay for things in dollars before. Now they simply can't. Now their salary has really lost a lot of its value, especially in the context of private American style universities that kind of are more or less similar to tuition in the United States. Kind of their tuition is similar to how it is here. And then yeah. There is the public option in Lebanon, but it doesn't seem like it's also the university, the public Lebanese university doesn't seem to also be in a great position now either, especially kind of with its relationship to the government, and the government probably it doesn't have anything to offer it either in terms of help.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to tell our audience that Philip Rad is going to teach an interdisciplinary course entitled Introduction to Middle East Studies in the spring. It will be an online course, and this will be offered through the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, Department of English, Department of Political Science, Department of History, and the Peace Studies minor. So there'll be opportunities for people to learn more from Philip about the Middle East, and we're really happy. I mean, this is, we are fortunate, right, that the crisis has brought you home for the time being, that you're able to give this tonight, and that you're also able to teach a course for us in the spring. So if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to thank our audience for being with us tonight. I'd also like to thank Philip for being our speaker, and thank you, everyone. All right. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
Is that some family of yours? Your family are imposters, right?
Yeah. I don't know who gave him the link.
Everybody.
That was me, sorry.
That was great, Philip. You did a great job. I learned so
Thanks, I
much.
appreciate it.
I'd
Thanks, I
like to see
appreciate
it
it.
again. I think if I heard it one more time, I could actually